May 1945. A civilian cemetery in a Bavarian village. Rain falls on rows of freshly dug soil, turning the graveyard into a heavy soup of gray mud. American soldiers move quietly among the plots, pencils and clipboards in hand, checking dog tags and documenting the casualties of a ruined empire. Then they stop. In one section of the cemetery, the ground is immaculate. Pristine wooden crosses stand in perfect alignment, surrounded by freshly cut grass and vibrant, hand-picked flowers. Just 50 yards away, in a dark, waterlogged corner of the same yard, dozens of shallow dirt mounds sit entirely bare, neglected and turning to sludge under the downpour. A local official stands by the beautiful graves, smoothing his clean suit jacket with total satisfaction. He has drawn a line between the dead, but his arrogant display is about to trigger a harsh, unforgettable lesson from General George Patton. This is the story of an arrogant German official who thought he could maintain the cruel hierarchies of the Third Reich even after its total defeat, and the American general who violently shattered that delusion. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when prejudice met consequences. Lieutenant Paul Stanton was 26 years old and came from Chicago, Illinois. He belonged to the Graves Registration Service, a grim and exhausting assignment that had aged him far beyond his years. Before the war, he worked at a small family-owned funeral home on the south side of Chicago, a quiet life of soft voices and polished mahogany. He had enlisted out of a sense of obligation, but the reality of the European theater had stripped away any illusions of romantic warfare. For the past month, his world had been defined by the smell of damp earth, rain-soaked canvas, and the sharp chemical sting of formaldehyde. He had buried hundreds of men, handling both American soldiers and German casualties with the exact same quiet reverence. His uniform was permanently stained with dark mud, and his hands were raw from the cold handle of a shovel. He believed that once a breath left a human body, politics and rank ceased to exist. To him, every corpse was simply someone's son, deserving of a marker and a peaceful resting place. This deep conviction had carried him through the horror of the frontline cemeteries, but it was about to be severely tested by the local leadership of this small Bavarian town. Burgermeister Hans Gruber was 55 years old and a dedicated, lifelong Nazi functionary who ruled the village with an iron fist. He had spent the war behind a large wooden desk, safely removed from the artillery shells and the freezing mud of the eastern and western fronts. Even with American tanks parked in the town square, Gruber refused to abandon his posture of total authority. He walked through the village wearing a pristine wool suit, completely unblemished by the surrounding ruin, with a black mourning band pinned neatly over his left sleeve. He viewed the collapse of the Reich not as a moral failure, but as a temporary logistical setback caused by weaker men. In his mind, the social hierarchy of the regime remained entirely absolute, extending even past the threshold of the grave. He firmly believed that the fanatical SS officers who had died defending the region were the true elite heroes of the nation, while the common conscripts and forced laborers were nothing more than disposable peasants who had failed their duties to the state. His shoes were perfectly polished, his hair was neatly combed, and he looked down upon the muddy American recovery teams with a cold, unearned arrogance that infuriated every soldier who saw him. By May 1945, the European war was practically over, but the wreckage left behind was vast and disorganized. The Allied forces were pushing deep into the heart of Germany, encountering hundreds of small villages that had been completely cut off from the collapsing central government in Berlin. As the formal structures of the Third Reich crumbled, local administrations were left in a state of absolute chaos, often running on the lingering momentum of fanatical wartime policies. The Supreme Command had tasked specific units, including the Graves Registration Service, with entering these newly occupied territories to clean up the physical remnants of the conflict, identify the dead, and establish a sense of basic order. In many towns, frontline combat officers were exhausted and focused entirely on securing supply lines or tracking down hidden resistance cells, often leaving minor local administrative decisions to whoever happened to be standing in the town hall. Many American commanders simply did not have the time or the personnel to police the internal social dynamics of every small cemetery they encountered along the road. This lack of direct oversight allowed some stubborn local officials to maintain their political biases and continue enforcing regime ideologies right under the noses of the occupying forces. They assumed the Americans would either not notice or simply not care about how the dead were handled, as long as the roads remained clear and the weapons were surrendered. In this particular Bavarian village, that neglect had created a stark, disturbing division between the favored loyalists of the regime and the expendable laborers who had been forced to fuel it. The local leadership assumed the victorious army would blindly accept this final display of institutional arrogance, but the arrival of the recovery teams was about to bring the entire situation to a sudden and very tense halt. Lieutenant Stanton stood in the center of the muddy cemetery, staring at the immaculate rows of flower-covered graves before turning his gaze toward the barren dirt mounds. He called out to the village official, trying to maintain a professional tone despite the tightness in his chest. Mayor Gruber walked over slowly, carefully stepping around the puddles to avoid ruining the shine on his leather shoes. Stanton pointed a muddy hand toward the pristine wooden crosses and asked why these specific plots had been meticulously manicured while the others were left to rot in the mud. Gruber looked at the lieutenant with an amused expression and replied that the graves with the fresh flowers belonged to the brave officers of the SS, the true defenders of the fatherland. Stanton adjusted his clipboard, his voice flat, and reminded the mayor that under military administration, all war dead within the district boundaries had to be registered and accounted for with equal care. He stated that the muddy mounds in the corner contained human remains that required proper identification and standard markers immediately. Gruber scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his clean wool suit. He told the lieutenant that those unappealing dirt piles contained nothing but simple regular conscripts and foreign forced laborers from the factories. He added that those individuals were merely weak peasants who had ultimately failed the state when the pressure mounted, meaning they did not merit any official recognition or public respect. Stanton stepped closer, the sharp scent of formaldehyde radiating from his uniform, as he ordered the mayor to bring out the village work crews to clear the mud and place identical wooden markers on every single grave in the yard by sunset. Gruber shook his head with an arrogant smile, looking down his nose at the young American officer. He declared that he would absolutely not allow the local resources or the town's beautiful flowers to be wasted on common failures and inferior laborers. He stated firmly that the elite soldiers of the Reich deserved an elevated status that a common American soldier could never understand. Stanton stared at the local official for a long, silent moment, realizing that his administrative authority meant absolutely nothing to this unrepentant functionary. He realized the situation had gone far beyond a routine registration dispute and required a completely different level of enforcement. He closed his logbook with a loud snap, turned on his heel without saying another word, and walked straight back to his field telephone to contact headquarters. The detailed report of the mayor's defiance reached General Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled up directly to the cemetery gate. The metallic screech of the brakes cutting through the steady patter of the rain. The 4 silver stars on his helmet gleamed even under the overcast sky, and the famous ivory-handled revolvers rested prominently on his hips. Every American soldier in the yard immediately snapped to attention, their boots sinking into the thick mud. Patton stepped down from the vehicle with deliberate, slow movements, his eyes scanning the sharp contrast between the immaculate flower beds and the barren dirt mounds. He did not raise his voice. He walked directly toward the local official, his presence completely filling the damp air. Patton studied him. The general stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch until the mayor began to shift uncomfortably on his polished shoes. Then he spoke. "Are you the official responsible for this cemetery?" Patton asked. Gruber nodded quickly, adjusting his suit jacket, and replied that he was indeed the burgomaster of the village. "Did you order these specific graves to be decorated with flowers and manicured so carefully?" Patton asked. Gruber smiled slightly, stating that he had ordered the flowers exclusively for the elite heroes of the SS who had defended the region. "And did you order that those other men be left completely unmarked in the mud?" Patton asked, pointing a gloved finger at the barren corner. Gruber cleared his throat, explaining that those mounds contained only regular conscripts and forced laborers who did not deserve honor. Patton looked at the mayor, his voice cold and sharp as a razor. He stated that the local official seemed to believe that the political hierarchies of a collapsed empire still carried weight under American military occupation. He noted that the mayor had spent the war sitting comfortably behind a wooden desk, while ensuring that the men who died for his twisted ideology were separated by class and rank, even in the dirt. He pointed out that Lieutenant Stanton had spent the past month working in the freezing rain, treating every fallen human being with the exact same level of dignity and care, regardless of what uniform they wore. He declared that in death, every single individual is reduced to nothing more than meat and bone, and that no man has the right to carry his arrogance into a graveyard. Patton told the mayor that his authority was entirely finished, and that his manufactured class distinctions were officially over. He gave the local official two distinct options. He could either pick up a shovel right now and personally rectify the physical disrespect he had created, or he could be placed in a military holding cell to await a formal tribunal for obstructing army regulations. "Decide now," Patton said. Gruber looked at the general, the arrogant smile completely vanishing from his face as he realized his clean wool suit would not protect him from the immediate reality of his choice. He slowly looked down at the mud, his hands trembling as he reached out to accept the heavy iron shovel from a nearby soldier. Meyer Gruber took off his fine wool suit jacket, revealing a tailored white shirt that was quickly ruined by the downpour. He drove the heavy iron shovel into the waterlogged dirt of the immaculate SS graves, his hands slipping against the wooden handle, under the cold glare of General Patton and the silent watch of the American troops. The local official began the agonizing process of dismantling the pristine displays he had created. He lifted the heavy wooden crosses out of the earth, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the thick mud splattered across his polished shoes and trousers. He carried the pristine markers 50 yards across the cemetery, his feet sinking deep into the gray sludge with every step. He moved the fresh, hand-picked flowers away from the elite officers and placed them carefully onto the barren dirt mounds of the regular conscripts and forced laborers. The local villagers gathered along the iron fence of the graveyard, watching in absolute silence as their arrogant leader sweated and strained in the mud, completely stripped of his former dignity. The sharp scent of wet soil and bruised petals filled the air as the empty, neglected corner of the cemetery was slowly transformed into a place of recognition. Gruber worked without a pause, his fine clothes soaked to the skin, completely broken by the mirrored reality of his punishment. Lieutenant Stanton returned to Chicago after the war, resuming his quiet life at the family funeral home. He lived a long and peaceful life, rarely talking about his time in Europe. But his colleagues noticed he always handled the arrangements for penniless strangers with the exact same care as the city's wealthiest citizens. He died peacefully in 1988, carrying the memory of that muddy Bavarian morning to his own grave. Mayor Gruber was officially removed from his administrative post by the military government the very next morning. He was forced to stand trial before a denazification tribunal in 1947, where his record of fanatical party loyalty resulted in a strict prison sentence and the total confiscation of his family estate. He spent his remaining years living in a cramped, drafty apartment on the outskirts of Munich, bitter and forgotten, until his death in 1963. General Patton never mentioned the incident in his public briefings, viewing it as a routine matter of establishing basic discipline in an occupied zone. He did, however, record a brief thought in his personal diary later that week. noting that some men had to be physically forced to understand that a shovel makes all human beings equal. Some historians have argued that General Patton's heavy-handed intervention in local civic matters was an unnecessary overreach of military authority, claiming that battlefield commanders should have left minor municipal management and community cemetery disputes to the newly established regional civil affairs teams. They suggest that such public humiliations did little to foster long-term cooperation during the delicate initial phase of the Allied occupation. Others have argued the exact opposite, maintaining that immediate, uncompromising actions were absolutely vital to completely break the entrenched psychological hold of the regime, and to demonstrate that the old social privileges would no longer be tolerated under American administration. What is certain is that the physical transformation of the graveyard remained permanent, leaving a clear and undeniable message to the entire population that the wartime stratification had come to a definitive end. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have left the matter entirely to the local civil affairs teams to resolve through standard bureaucratic channels? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when prejudice met consequences, make sure to subscribe.